Oh, hi there, boys and ghouls. Are you ready for a bedtime story? My name's Megan if you're new here, and if not, welcome back to Here She Lies, a fact or fiction horror podcast that will have you questioning everything you once held dear. Each week we'll dive into another heart-stopping tale of terror. Some of them are true, and others are just big fat fibs. It's up to you to decide which is which. If you're watching on YouTube, hit that subscribe button and the notification bell, and if you're tuning in via your favourite podcast app, then please remember to leave a big juicy 5-star review. Make sure you have your say either in the comments box below or over on our Instagram page at Here She Lies Podcast. Now, before you position yourself behind the sofa and grab your snacks, I'll reveal the answer to our last episode because God knows you've waited long enough. Let's journey back to the spring of 2017 in the bustling city of London, England, where university student Cara Stevens had been dealing with a bit of a pest problem. The pest being an obsessive stalker. I'm sure we've all had that one stubborn ex-partner who just can't take no for an answer. But to have no idea of who's harassing you must be a whole new level of terror. Will poor Cara spend the rest of her days looking over her shoulder? Or is she just a character that I cooked up in my literary cauldron? Well, if you guessed that this story was 100% false, you'd be wrong. You see, while some details have been changed for production value, the story of the Happy Birthday Stalker is actually based in fact. Yep, believe it or not, this happened to a girl that I worked with many moons ago, and without fail, each year on her birthday, she would receive the same anonymous bouquets. Everywhere she went, every job she had, those floral arrangements would follow. And despite moving careers several times, the flowers always arrived with that same ominous message. Happy birthday. She never did figure out who was sending those bouquets, and still to this day, it's a mystery that creeps me out a little. On a brighter note, your girl has been a busy wee bee in her absence, and what would a sketchy sleepover be without a scary story? So Gremolonies, turn the UV lights down low, cuddle your SPF, and welcome to episode 5 of Here She Lies. I call this one Death by Tanning Bed.
911, what's your emergency?
You calling me a liar?
Oh my god, you coming? We are coming.
Tanning beds. A bit of a taboo subject here in 2024, what with the risk of skin cancer, etc. But back in the early 90s, they were a staple in most UK households. Yes, if we were to jump in our hot tub time machine and slide on back to 1997, you'd be hard pressed to find a family who didn't at one point share their home with the electric buzz of a sunbed. Along with chain smoking and chugging the odd glass of rosé whilst pregnant, the risks of flooding our bodies with UV rays was just another thing that scientists hadn't quite figured out yet. So, every winter, mums in their neon shell suits would stomp on down to the local tanning shop to rent the Melanoma 3000 in order to build up that summer glow. Looking back on the 90s as a whole, it was the decade that changed modern beauty standards forever. All of a sudden, looking painfully thin was fashionable, as was bleach blonde hair and a California tan that Pamela Anderson would have been proud of. Prior to the early 1990s, natural beauty had been the norm and was even celebrated. But now, with the help of modern technology, you could transform into a different version of yourself. All you needed was the cash. In the blink of an eye, the English rose was out and the perfectly engineered woman was in. And along with genuine promotions for cosmetic surgery, many brands played on the fact that, according to the media, being ugly was no longer fashionable.
Although people love that subtle classic taste, Martini's glamorous image makes some feel too self-conscious to drink it. Frankly, they feel too ugly to drink it. Do you know anyone ugly who'd like to enjoy the beautiful drink? Would you like us to cosmetically transform their head? Call this number. You could look as good as Jonathan. With Martini, we can make Britain a more beautiful place.
Were these advertisements deeply offensive? Yes, but did anyone care? Not really. You see, the vibe of the time was have a big nose, fix it. Have tiny boobs, get bigger ones. Have pale skin, tan it. And whilst those little coffins of doom may have seemed pretty harmless at the time, we would only learn in the next coming years the true cost of hiring a sunbed for the summer. But today's story doesn't take place in the slightly more enlightened year of 2024. No, it belongs in the archives along with Kate Moss's comments about being thin and Donald Trump's real hair. Now, as we said, the mid-90s was definitely an interesting era to experience firsthand. And no one knows this better than the friends and loved ones of a then 19-year-old glamour model named Britney Chavez. Britney, originally from Tulsa, Oklahoma, grew up far from the bright lights and big names of Los Angeles, California. She was a farm girl born and raised and would wake up at 4 a.m. on the dot every morning to help her father with the chores. Now, most teenagers struggle to get out of bed at 4 p.m, let alone 4 a.m, but Britney had been doing this since she was 5, and she could practically muck out the pens in her sleep. Of course, like a lot of children who grew up on a farm, Britney wished she could be doing something, anything else. Her life was a strict schedule of milking cattle, doing homework and attending Sunday service. She didn't have a lot of free time to socialise, and it wasn't as though Tulsa had much to offer in the way of nightlife anyhow. Instead, the petite blonde would find herself escaping within the pages of the latest fashion magazines. She would have to hide them from her daddy though, because, in his own words, those models should be turning to Jesus, not G-strings. Regardless of her parents' conservative views, Britney was still fascinated by these beautiful beings that graced the glossy front pages. She couldn't help but be drawn in by their effervescent glow and Hollywood smiles, and would spend hours in front of the mirror trying to emulate the latest hairstyle trends. Makeup was strictly forbidden in the Chavez household, but Britney had managed to stash a little red lipstick that came free with an issue of Elle. When everyone was asleep, she would dab the creamy ruby red formula over her lips, fluffing her golden locks and pouting just like her favourite cover girls did. She fantasized of a life away from Tulsa, away from the farm and all of its restrictions, and prayed that one day she too would make it on the cover of a magazine. Scrubbing off any final remnants of rouge lipstick from her mouth, she wondered if this was it. Just a small town future for a small town girl. And with that thought, she flicked the switch on her bedside lamp. That weekend was like any other for the Chavez family. Early rises and late finishes, only to look forward to the same thing all over again. Britney finished her dinner in her room, under the pretense that she was running behind on an overdue book report and wanted to work while she ate. Normally her mother would object, but as her husband always said, school comes first, so she relented. In reality, there was no book report. Instead, Britney was flipping through an old issue of Playboy she'd managed to swipe from her older brother's bedroom. She'd walked in on him a few days prior and caught him frantically shoving something under his pillow. Curiosity got the better of her, and knowing he would be too embarrassed to confront her about it, she snatched it whilst he was in the bath one night. Initially, she was a little taken aback by the pictures. Smut, her father would have called it. But with each turning of the page, her shock wore off and she was able to appreciate them for what they really were. Art. Every girl, polished to perfection, was positioned seductively within a handcrafted set that told its own individual story. These finessed beauty shots were a far cry from your average back issue of Hustler, and Britney devoured the magazine within a matter of minutes. From the second she skimmed past the front cover, she was hooked, and this tiny glimpse into the world of Hugh Hefner and his glamorous Playboy bunnies only left her wanting more. Over the next few months, Britney would dip into her brother Jason's bedroom to raid his secret stash. She craved the escapism that each one provided and dreamt of the day when she might be able to experience a real-life photo shoot for herself. Little did she know, however, that that day was quickly approaching. It was the week after graduation, and Britney and her former classmates were making the most of the warm weather. It had been uncommonly cold that spring, so when the sun finally made an appearance, the teens wanted to take full advantage of the heat. They'd settled on the idea of a bonfire with some snacks and cheap booze. Britney wasn't much of a drinker, but she was excited to celebrate with her friends, and so she and a couple of girlfriends headed to the local mall to scout for new outfits. About an hour after they arrived at the Woodland Hills Mall, they headed to Hot Dog on a Stick to grab a little snack. However, as Britney squirted ketchup on her corn dog from the dispenser, she felt a firm hand on her forearm from behind. She spun around, almost dropping her lunch in the process, and to her horror, she found that the owner of said hand was a stocky, middle-aged man. He was casual, yet smartly dressed, and on his wrist he wore a gaudy gold shiny watch that would put Mr. T to shame. Instinctively, Britney yanked her arm backwards, asking in a firm tone, what did he want? For a moment, the man said nothing, just stared at her, eyeing her whole body with a glance that left her feeling nauseated. He finally broke the silence between them and began apologising profusely. Britney wasn't really listening. She just wanted this guy to leave her alone. But before she could say anything, he abruptly reached into his back pocket. Britney was preparing to break into a full sprint when she noticed the business card that was now being thrust in her face. According to the 3x2 piece of black card, this little preppy man was Doug Sprouse, and also a talent agent based in California. Still wary of his true intentions, Britney cautiously plucked the card from his fingers. It looked legitimate enough, but with the availability of Xerox, she couldn't be too sure. She politely listened as Doug told her what he did for a living, and that she had the perfect look for a job that was casting in a few days in California. He claimed that a friend of his was directing an upcoming beer commercial and that she was exactly the type they'd been searching for. Pointing out her natural sandy blonde curls and athletic figure, Doug said that if she was chosen to star in the advertisement, it could lead to bigger and better opportunities. Britney was completely caught off guard by the offer, as were her friends Lauren and Stacey, who just stood there, mouths agape. For the first time in a very long while, she was speechless. So she silently nodded and agreed to give Doug a call when she'd spoken with her parents. She couldn't believe it. The moment Doug left, her girlfriends yapped 1,000 questions at her. Questions that she had no way of answering. This had been such a shock. Things like this didn't happen in Tulsa, especially not to homely farm girls like her. What Britney was unable to see was that underneath her baggy flannel shirts, loose ripped jeans, and hair still smelling of dung from that morning's muck out, was that she was a textbook 10 out of 10. She was definitely well liked at school, but none of the local boys really tried to date her because it was common knowledge that Mr. Chavez was crazy strict, and like most farmers, he owned a lot of guns. The whole ride home, Britney sat in quiet contemplation, wondering how she would broach the subject of Doug Sprouse to her parents, but more specifically to her dad. Just after 3 p.m, Britney sheepishly walked in the front door. Only that morning, the biggest problem she had was deciding what to wear to the bonfire, and now she felt like the weight of the world was on her shoulders. As she snuck into the house, she clocked her mum and dad sitting at the kitchen table. Britney stood in the same spot by the door for a moment, going over what she would say in her head. She wasn't sure how her parents would handle this information. Would they get angry, give her the silent treatment? Would they even acknowledge it at all? One thing was for sure, she would never know unless she walked into that kitchen and had the conversation. At first, her dad just stared at the card. Her mother, on the other hand, was full of questions, so many that she could barely keep up. Britney did her best, but at the same time, she couldn't help but focus on her father, who still sat motionless with the business card in his hand. She waited for any kind of reaction. She found his silence more unnerving than if he were screaming and shouting. After what seemed like an eternity, her dad finally got up out of his seat and headed over to the telephone hanging on the wall nearby. Who could he be calling right now? Britney feared she was about to be sent off to one of those Christian military schools before remembering that she was 19 and her daddy couldn't use that threat to keep her in line anymore. She watched on as he lifted the receiver and punched in the number from the business card. Doug Sprouse's number. Both Britney and her mum winced, anticipating the barrage of insults that would soon follow. Mr. Chavez wasn't known in the community for being a calm, well-tempered soul. In fact, many were a little afraid of him and his glum disposition. He had a reputation of being hot-headed, and in that moment, Britney was sure that she and her mother were about to be reminded why. Instead, however, they were taken aback when this firm, business-like tone came out of his mouth. He introduced himself as Britney's father and began quizzing the person on the other end of the phone, who they could only assume was Mr. Sprouse. The two women exchanged glances in complete disbelief. Was this real life? Britney had expected a lot of different outcomes from their conversation. This wasn't one of them. A few minutes passed, and after exchanging pleasantries, her dad eventually hung up the landline. He walked over to his family, still shook from this bizarre turn of events, and simply said, "You've to pack a bag. You too, Jeannie. He'll call back tomorrow to arrange a lift." And with that, he was gone, striding back towards the pens outside. Britney felt like she would have to hire a forklift to pick her mother's jaw up off of the floor. Jean Chavez had been married to her husband for 25 years. He had never surprised her, until right now. The young Tulsan teen knew better than to look a gift horse in the mouth, so she ran upstairs to start packing, praying that her dad wouldn't reconsider. Derek Chavez never did explain to his family why the sudden change of heart that day, but when the time came for his wife and daughter to leave for California, Britney noticed an unfamiliar expression etched across his face. She wasn't quite sure if it was pride or worry. The trip to the City of Angels went off without a hitch. The casting director adored Britney and her whole girl-next-door demeanour. Although she'd never posed in front of a big fancy camera before, she'd had plenty of practice in her bedroom mirror, and even Mum Jean could see that her baby was a natural. The whole experience was incredible, yet slightly overwhelming for Britney. Each day she was introduced to dozens of new people, usually men, and usually with their own set of new questions for her. Throughout their stay, the duo kept in touch with Derek, and although a man of very few words, he told his wife that he was glad they were having a nice time. The 3 days in LA went by in a flash, and once filming had wrapped, a very lethargic Britney travelled back to her hotel, prepared for the journey back home. She and Jean were busy stuffing some free toiletries into their cases when the little yellow telephone in the corner of their room started to ring. Her mother answered whilst Britney continued to pack, and, assuming it was her father calling, she just moseyed around the room, making sure they hadn't forgotten anything. Jean Chavez had never been one to present a good poker face, so the look of concern she was now wearing was something she couldn't hide from her 19-year-old daughter. Her first thought was that something had happened back at the farm, something terrible. But ending the call, her mother finally spoke, stating, "It's Playboy, Brit. They want you to do Playboy." Within seconds, Jean was frantically dialing another number. Britney, still in a haze, realised what she was doing and lunged forward, grabbing the phone off of the side table and away from her mother. She begged her not to call her dad, because, in all honesty, she knew what his response would be. On occasions where he'd discovered his son's collection of dirty magazines, he'd had some choice words for the women who graced their covers. Jezebels, skanks and heathens were his favourites, and whilst of course Britney didn't share those same barbaric views, she knew that accepting an offer from Playboy would forever alter her father's perception of her, and she couldn't handle that right now. Britney pleaded with her mother, but she could see how uncomfortable she was at the thought of keeping this Playboy deal a secret from her husband. In the quarter of a century that Jean had been with Derek, she'd never ever been dishonest with him, not once. And this wasn't just a silly white lie. In his eyes, this would be a huge betrayal of trust, one that she wasn't sure they could come back from. She looked across at her little girl, tears pooling in her big blue Bambi eyes. Yes, Jean Chavez had never lied to her husband, but she figured that lying to protect the happiness of her child was a pretty good reason to start. If only she'd known that this choice would leave the Chavez family in tatters, and one of them dead. Over the next 3 days, Britney managed to dazzle at every meeting whilst also keeping her father in the dark about what was really going on. She was pushed around from boardrooms to luxurious beauty salons, and when it was time for her to start shooting, she was just happy to be in one place for an afternoon. However, as soon as she arrived, she could sense that something wasn't right. People were looking at her and whispering in hushed, angry tones. And after what was a very uncomfortable 20 minutes, a woman rushed over to her and said, "Your skin, it's so white." Britney was embarrassed. She'd always had that same icy, translucent glow with a couple of freckles scattered around here and there. She was never someone who tanned, so she couldn't quite understand their point. As much as she tried to interject, Britney was told in so many words that if she couldn't come back with a tan, she wouldn't be coming back at all. She was given the name of some local tanning bed shops and ushered out of the door. For a moment, she stood on the sidewalk, flabbergasted. having just been told she basically had to change her DNA makeup and that she had just 7 days to do so. As soon as she arrived back at the hotel, Britney immediately began calling all of the numbers scribbled on her call sheet. However, she soon realised that there were rules to getting the perfect California girl tan. Rules that she didn't have the time for. Each person she spoke with said the same. 6 minutes a day was the limit, with 24 hours in between each session. But 6 minutes a day wouldn't be enough to turn her pasty complexion into that of a glowing goddess. Wrestling with her thoughts, the young farm girl slumped down on the bed in frustration. She was at the point of tears when a devilish idea popped into her head. Yes, she was only permitted to tan for 6 minutes at each salon, but there were no guidelines to say just how many salons she could visit in one day. Before Britney knew it, she was arranging multiple appointments for multiple tanning shops. 3 6-minute sessions a day for 6 days, 108 blissful minutes in the sun would surely do the trick. By the end of that week, Britney was definitely rocking a nice summer glow, and when she arrived on set on the 20th of June, she felt and looked amazing. The Playboy team were thrilled with her new tan, and crew members watched on as the once shy country girl came to life in front of the camera. She was born for this. It was everything Britney had dreamed of and so much more. However, as the shoot went on, the amateur model began feeling a little bit off. A wave of nausea and dizziness enveloped her, and she had to grab onto a wooden prop to steady herself. A couple of runners scurried over, concerned about what was going on. One in particular bent down to Britney's face, only to be met with a terribly foul odour when she spoke. The stench was familiar, like rotting meat, and it was coming from Britney's mouth. Without warning, her hand slipped away completely limp. She went down, quickly crashing from the artificial steps to the concrete floor below. It wasn't too bad of a fall, but those around her could see that Britney wasn't moving or making a sound. One by one they approached her lifeless body, and several even gasped at what lay ahead. There, still illuminated by the studio lights, lay Britney Denise Chavez, eyes wide open, fingers clutching at her stomach. EMTs rushed to the scene, but unfortunately it was already too late. She was gone. Both Jean and Derek arrived at the hospital shattered with grief. They couldn't understand how their little ball of energy had suddenly been snuffed out. And of course, like any parent would, they wanted answers. Initially, doctors were dumbfounded. Britney looked like any healthy young female. Externally, there were no clues as to why or how she died. It wasn't until they opened her up for an autopsy that horrified technicians discovered something so bizarre it would spark not just national interest, but global. You see, within the flesh tomb that had once been the body of a bubbly 19-year-old were the cooked organs of Britney Chavez. Yes, you heard me. Cooked. Remember all of those tanning bed sessions? Well, according to doctors, they'd taken their toll on Britney's insides, and in turn, she'd literally been fried from the inside out. The Chavezes were understandably devastated. Jean blamed herself for her daughter's gruesome death, and although he'd never say it out loud, so did Derek. He was a religious man, and he saw Britney's demise as some sort of biblical punishment for her recent modelling career. They never spoke openly about the loss of their only daughter. Instead, Derek and Jean lived out their days on the farm, poisoned by a quiet resentment for one another. Of course, Playboy wanted to distance themselves from the strange incident as much as they could, bleeding out thousands of dollars to silence both the Chavezes and their story. As the saying goes, money talks, and almost 40 years later, the tale of the girl killed by a sunbed has turned into nothing more than a nostalgic urban legend. Most of the original details have been completely forgotten, and I can't help but wonder if Playboy had something to do with that. Here in 2024, we've learned of the dangers of UV exposure and that what was once described as the safe alternative to sunbathing wasn't so safe at all. It's truly a privilege to live in a time of statistics and medical data available at the touch of our fingertips, something that us 90s kids just didn't have. Was Britney naive? Perhaps even a little vain? Yes, but after learning about her life and her dreams, to me, she'll always be more than the headline that follows her. Death by tanning beds. The end. Oh no, what a horrible wee tale. It really brings back those vivid memories of Final Destination 3. I don't know about you guys, but the minute I hear the song Roller Coaster of Love, I start writing out my will and testament. I can't even imagine the agony of having your contents cooked and the smell. Oh, this one is a dark episode for sure. But is it one based in truth, or did I just bake the whole thing up? Let me know what you guys think, and we'll be back next week with the answer. However, before we head off into the sunset, I want to announce a whole new segment that involves you guys, and it's called Pants on Fire. I want to know what is the worst lie that you lot have ever told. I want the tea, I want the dirt, I want the goss, and you can send it straight to me at heresheliespodcast@gmail.com. Do it anonymously. Don't do it anonymously. I don't care. I just want to hear your secrets. And on that deceitful note, I bid you adieu. Find out next week if it was false or if it was true. Good night.
911, what's your emergency?
You calling me a liar?
Oh my god, you coming? We are coming.